Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center. I'm Jeff Rosen, the president of this great institution. And for our friend and board member and visiting scholar, Hank Meijer, I want all of us to recite the mantra of the National Constitution Center to inspire us for the learning that's ahead. The National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Isn't that wonderful that the members of the congregation can recite it so well?
And I'm trying to object to that, since the other part of the group doesn't tell the truth. How can you be nonpartisan when there's lies?
That's an important challenge, and what we're going to try to do today is go back to a world where both sides trusted each other actually to deliberate, where there was less fear about fake news, where the institution of Congress was a place where Democrats and Republicans could deliberate together on behalf of the common good. And that's why it's so exciting to be able to share this remarkable book with you about Arthur Vandenberg. As you will learn from Hank Meijer, Vandenberg, perhaps the most important senator of the 20th century, embodied a bipartisan ideal that seems imperiled today, underwent a remarkable evolution from isolationism to interventionism, and can inspire us as we seek to respond to your questions, sir, about how to resurrect the framers' ideal of deliberative democracy today. Hank Meijer is a dear friend and trustee of the National Constitution Center. He worked as a reporter and editor before joining Meijer, Inc., where he's executive chairman. He's the author of a biography of his grandfather, Thrifty Years, The Life of Hendrik Meijer, and executive producer of the documentary America's Senator, The Unexpected Odyssey of Arthur Vandenberg. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Hank Meijer.
Thank you, Jeff.
I'm so glad you're here, Hank. And I need to begin by asking why you chose to write about Vandenberg and why you think he's important.
Combination of circumstances. Arthur Vandenberg was until now arguably the most important American public figure of the 20th century for whom there was no biography. So a wonderful sense of mission for a hometown boy from Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I'm from. He had been nearly forgotten in his hometown, much better remembered in parts of Europe for his work on the Marshall Plan than here in the United States. And so it was an opportunity to fill that little niche in history.
It's a large niche, and you fill it beautifully, and there's this overwhelming sense of a man who is capable of change, and he moved from being such a prominent isolationist into the most prominent interventionist. First tell us about that evolution and all the various stages that he went through.
Well, this was a young man who claimed he started reading the Congressional Record when he was 14. Now, it's hard to pin down evidence of that, but a passion that started very early. And when he was 16, he won an oratorical contest talking about the peace conference at The Hague. So very much, this is in 1900, very much passionate about world affairs. But then in the wake of World War I, where he joined Woodrow Wilson's crusade to make America safe for democracy, like so many people, came back from that disillusioned and deciding to reach back to the founding fathers, think about Alexander Hamilton and his warnings in Washington's farewell address about no entangling alliances, and that became his mantra. And in the 1930s, he was active on the Nye Committee, which was trying to figure out if it was munition makers and profiteers who had helped get the United States into World War I. He came further solidified as he fought with Franklin Roosevelt on many things. He became hardened as an isolationist and became, by 1939, the most outspoken Senate isolationist in resisting Roosevelt's attempts to get away from American neutrality and come to the aid of Britain and France as war loomed in Europe. And so in a short time between 1939 and 1940, when he was on the cover of Time magazine leading isolationists against, in defense of American neutrality, to 1945 when he became arguably the strongest American delegate at the founding of the United Nations, he went through a change that reflected a change happening in the American people.
Remarkable, a man who used the term, if he didn't coin it, America First during World War I, to such a strong isolationist, to such a strong interventionist. Was his an evolution that the Republican Party itself was going through, or was it more of a personal evolution, and why did he change?
It was very much a personal evolution, but the American Party, the Republican Party was split then, as it is so spectacularly now, between isolationists and those who wish to have a broader involvement of America in the world. And that was embodied in 1940 between the Taft and Vandenberg wing of the party and Wendell Willkie, who swept to the nomination with a foreign policy outlook that was much closer to Franklin Roosevelt's than to that traditional Republican outlook.
He was a great advocate of self-help and read and wrote self-help manuals. Tell us about those, and to what degree did that allow him to evolve?
Well, he very much pictured himself as a self-made man. His father had had a pretty prosperous harness business until Arthur was 9 years old. And then it may have been government contracts canceled during the administration of Grover Cleveland that hardened him into being a Republican. But he went to work at that very young age helping to support the family, and came away from that experience believing that you had to make your own way in life, and feeling a sense of insecurity that came from that disruption in his childhood. And so I think part of his life was also a search for security. And where did that lie? At first it seemed to lie in staying remote from the conflicts of the old world, and he later concluded that it came to lie in finding security, in mutual security with the other democracies.
That's fascinating. You do talk about how his father's being wiped out in the Panic of 1893 was very jarring for him. That search for security is a powerful one.
I think that really drove a lot of his outlook.
Tell us about his journalism, because he was a powerful journalist, and that was around the time that he took over the paper.
Yeah, absolutely. He became, at the age of 22, the editor of the Grand Rapids Herald, which was a medium-sized newspaper in a medium-sized town, very Republican, and then was editor of the Herald for the next 22 years until he went to Congress. And I think it's hard to picture today, where we have such fragmented media, how important those newspaper editors and publishers were. They were the source of news. They really had their own constituencies, practically, among their readers. And papers were generally partisan. His was a Democratic paper, or excuse me, a Republican paper, and he was sending his editorials to Washington, to Republicans he wanted to impress or influence. And so during the League of Nations debate in 1919, when Henry Cabot Lodge is leading the Republicans challenging ratification of the League of Nations covenant, Vandenberg is sending him his editorials. And Lodge writes back and said, I like that line. I'm going to steal that line that says, unshared idealism is a menace. And so he's influencing and he is one of the first people to call for reservations to the League covenant, not to opposing American membership in the League, but to finding a compromise between other isolationists who said, we don't want to be involved at all. Anything we do with a world organization compromises our sovereignty. And what Woodrow Wilson came back from Versailles with was, he was trying to sell the American people, you will take it as I present it with no reservations and no compromises. Vandenberg's trying to find a middle way and influencing other Republican leaders to try to find a middle way. Never succeeded, of course, and the rejectionists prevailed, and America rejected the League of Nations. But he was then also writing speeches for Warren Harding in 1920, and Warren Harding's most important speech, talking about Article 10, which was the controversial one in the League of Nations covenant, that calling for international cooperation. Vandenberg wrote Harding's speech and was really defining the Republican foreign policy to a great degree as a young editor in Grand Rapids.
It's remarkable how the Republican Party was split then between isolationist and interventionist. You've been kind enough to read the book I have coming out on William Howard Taft, and Taft, of course, was a strong supporter of the League of Nations and of world courts. There were isolationists on the other side. Why was Vandenberg, as an editor and later as a politician, able to find a middle ground? Why did public discourse allow the editor of a strongly Republican paper to seek moderation?
I think moderation was his guide. He was very scared of political extremes, and so he was always looking for a way for first his party to come together, and then for the parties to come together for the good of the country. And so it was interesting after World War I, when Woodrow Wilson has his stroke whilst trying to sell the League of Nations to the American people, has to return to Washington. Taft and some of the other senior Republicans were, in this case William Howard Taft, were working hard to help Wilson secure ratification of the covenant. And so Vandenberg is trying to reconcile their opinions with Henry Cabot Lodge's opinions. And I think he was always animated by that desire to find a middle ground.
And where did that come from? From Hamilton, from the founders, from his temperament?
Well, you know the Constitution so much better than I do, Jeff, but I think the Constitution was an exercise in finding the middle ground. And that recognition that you were Hamilton and you had strongly held beliefs, but you had to negotiate with Jefferson and other people to secure a constitution and secure a country. I think that informed his outlook.
So Hank, this is the central question, that the founders created this deliberative democracy where both sides could talk to each other, and Vandenberg recognized that and devoted his career to it, and now of course it seems gone. So we have to figure out together, teach us from Vandenberg, what was it about the Congress of his day that allowed him to reach out to Democrats, for example, during the court packing plan and to be bipartisan?
I think we have to look back and recognize that the Congress of his day, and this is 30s, 40s, really, we begin to see it erode with Roosevelt and then accelerate in the 60s and 70s, was a much more important body relative to the executive. They had not ceded as much decision-making and rule-making to the executive branch. And so on the face of it, Congress had a more crucial role to play, or at least assumed for itself a more crucial role. And then as Congress, within the Congress, there was that recognition that that a simple majority wasn't enough on the major questions of our time. I mean, it's what we see debated right now in Congress over health care and over tax reform. Is the only way we can get done something with 51 votes. Vandenberg was never comfortable with that. He said, these are major commitments that we're asking the American people to make, whether it's to the United Nations or to NATO or to the Marshall Plan. And it can't be done by such a narrow margin that it will be reversed or could be reversed or jeopardized by the next Congress. So he always recognized the need to build what I guess we would call supermajorities because consensus required it.
Were there rules in Congress that required those supermajorities that are not in place today?
Well, there were, of course. He was dealing with the international realm with treaties that, of course, required the 2/3 majority. And so he was very selective about when to go along with an agreement that Congress might only require 51 votes for, or in that case, this is before Alaska and Hawaii, so I have to recalculate my numbers. But that 2/3 majority was crucial for the United Nations or for NATO.
Fascinating. So the fact that he was dealing with foreign policy created this 2/3 requirement.
Yes.
Well, what about to take a domestic issue like court packing? Why did he choose to work with the Democrats to defeat it?
Well, he was, as an ardent constitutionalist, he abhorred the thought of tinkering with the Constitution for short-term political gain, which is how so many people viewed Roosevelt's effort to add additional justices because he didn't like the results he was getting from the current court. And so, but he also knew, but the Republicans were a significant minority. Their opposition wouldn't be enough. The Republicans and the Democrats, who were also opposed to it, had to work together. And he was astute enough, as were some of his colleagues, to say, you know what, we'd better step back. In fact, ex-President Hoover wants to speak out against Roosevelt's plans with the court. He's very bitter about it. Let's keep him quiet. Let's let the Democrats take the lead. And so some of the other senators, Burt Wheeler from Montana, a Democrat who later became one of the last holdout isolationists when Vandenberg had moved significantly, led the Democrats in opposition, and the Republicans held their fire, but were ready to join the Democrats when the time came for a vote.
And my hero, Louis Brandeis, worked with the journalist Marquis Childs to convey a letter to the Senate saying that the court wasn't overworked. It seems like all the branches, the judiciary, Congress, and even the press, are working together on behalf of this Hamiltonian ideal of deliberation.
And it's fascinating to see the Senate and the court reaching out to each other. The Wheeler wanted Chief Justice Stone to testify before Congress and say, no, we're not overworked. We don't need these additional justices. But Stone and Brandeis, if I understand it, thought that was beneath the dignity of the court to subject themselves, in this case, to pro-Roosevelt people who'd be attacking the justices in a hearing. And so it was Brandeis's brilliant suggestion for Stone to send a letter saying, the opponents are right. We're not overworked. We don't need your help, President Roosevelt.
So what's different today? You wouldn't have one justice tell the chief to send a letter to a journalist who would give it to Congress. The justice would just tweet it or something like that.
And is that as deliberative? I don't know.
Well, that's the question. Are tweets and the lack of secrecy, basically, the fact that everything is transparent makes compromise much more difficult. There are a couple of these agreements where you talk about Vandenberg being able to reach across the aisle and compromise simply because they can have backstage negotiations.
Oh, clearly. And in fact, when it came time to, so after the United Nations and the Marshall Plan, which Vandenberg steered through the Senate, there's a recognition that, well, the European economies needed to be rebuilt, there was also a power vacuum. And while many Americans may have overestimated the threat from the Soviet Union, it was indisputable that the Red Army was controlling Eastern Europe, and the Americans wanted to bring their troops home, and the European militaries were devastated. And so some of the European nations the Western Europeans came together and said, we need a mutual defense pact, which of course will be powerless without significant American commitment. And that became the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the American resolution, the Vandenberg resolution approving that, which was drawn up by Vandenberg working with Undersecretary of State Robert Lovett in Vandenberg's apartment on Connecticut Avenue. And Lovett could stop by basically on the way home from work and have a martini with Vandenberg and keep bringing him State Department drafts of resolutions. And Vandenberg saying, no, we got to get it down to one page. And so you go talk to Hazel, my wife, for a few minutes. And Vandenberg retired and typed up a one-page resolution that became the Vandenberg resolution. And so there was that kind of ability to work, I guess you'd call that in secret, but just in a way that allowed the Democratic administration and at that time the Republican majority in Congress to come to an agreement.
During this period, talking about the Soviet threat, Vandenberg used the phrase "the Iron Curtain" in public before Churchill did.
This was classic. In the fall of 1945, Vandenberg is upset now. The war in Japan has just ended, and so the big question is, what is Russia up to? And the Iron Curtain was initially referring to the lack of press freedom and access so that the West could know what was happening in Russian-occupied Eastern Europe. And Vandenberg rises in the Senate to give what he calls his Iron Curtain speech. And this is in the days when each senatorial speech of significance, if the senator thought enough of it, he had special stationery printed up, and the envelope says the Iron Curtain speech. And he gives this speech saying what's going on behind this Iron Curtain. And his ally in many future negotiations, who was then Thomas Dewey's chief foreign policy advisor was John Foster Dulles, later Eisenhower Secretary of State. And Dulles writes to Vandenberg, and so Vandenberg gives his speech the same day that Eisenhower has just returned triumphantly from Europe with the end of the war, and there's a big parade and a lot of hoopla, and I think a spy ring was uncovered also, but there were other big news, and so Vandenberg's speech is totally neglected. And Dulles says to him, "Great speech, a lot of good stuff in there, particularly that ringing phrase. I think you've got a great coinage here. Too bad nobody heard, but I think the coinage will catch on." And then Churchill, who had used the phrase Iron Curtain in the UK in some of his conversations, it wasn't used in a public speech in the US until the spring of 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, when Churchill in Truman's presence refers to the Iron Curtain. So there's about a 6-month lag there when Vandenberg could have used it for the first time, but it was totally forgotten. But there was no competing media attention when Churchill gave his speech.
Well, there was another foreign policy speech Vandenberg gave that did get huge attention, so much so that it was called the speech heard round the world. Tell us about that.
This was in January 10th of 1945. The war is in its waning moments. We've come through the Battle of the Bulge. The U.S. and the Russians are pushing in on Germany. Island by island, we're recapturing territory in the Pacific. And Roosevelt is scheduled to go to Yalta to meet with Stalin and Churchill, where at a summit where now the attention is being turned from military strategy to what's going to happen after the war, to plan for some kind of United Nations. And Roosevelt did so many things so brilliantly, but also acted as his own State Department. He basically didn't pay much attention to what was coming out of the State Department from Cordell Hull and then his successor, kind of a functionary, a former U.S. Steel executive named Edward Stettinius. Roosevelt was doing his own thing, sending Harry Hopkins on missions to Churchill and to Stalin. And in Congress, both parties were getting very restive. What's going to happen after the war? We've got no plans here. And here you're going off to Yalta, and we don't know what kind of deals are being cut. And so Democrats and Republicans alike want to introduce resolutions. William Fulbright, first as a congressman and then as a senator, has one on the Democratic side. Roosevelt squashes it. Vandenberg is frustrated. What's going to happen? And so he stands up in the Senate on January 10th, 1945, just before the inauguration, before Roosevelt departs later that month for Yalta, and says, we need a post-war security treaty between the victorious Allies to make sure that Germany is never again a threat, as they have been twice in the past generation, to the peace of the world. So here you've got this isolationist who's still in the public mind, even as his views have been evolving, is a leading isolationist calling for a post-war peacetime treaty, an entangling alliance. And this is a big deal. And so James Reston, who had a little bias because he was a New York Times Washington correspondent, who was a friend of Vandenberg's and probably helped write the speech, certainly looked at some of the drafts, called it the speech heard around the world. And it projected Vandenberg, gave him a completely new image in the public mind. And Roosevelt, sort of condescending and dismissive, didn't really pay much attention to it in public. But just before he left for Yalta, the State Department called up and said, we need 50 copies of the speech to bring with us to Yalta. And so that was Vandenberg coming out on the world stage. And what happened then was Roosevelt, who had viewed Vandenberg as a sometime rival and a rather bitter one at that, recognized that he could not avoid naming Vandenberg to the American delegation at the founding meeting of the United Nations that was coming up in the summer of 1945. And of course, that was what the mistake Woodrow Wilson had made that alienated the Republicans after World War I, when he had gone to Versailles himself and brought no Republicans of any stature with him. And so Roosevelt, that whole generation of Roosevelt, Vandenberg, Truman, they were so keenly aware of what a disaster the post-war talks had been after World War I, that they all wanted to avoid that mistake. And so Roosevelt had no choice but to name Vandenberg to the UN conference.
Wow, and then that ushers in this golden period of bipartisan foreign policy where Vandenberg's achievements include not only the UN and NATO, as you described, but also the Marshall Plan. Tell us about those achievements.
Well, and so Roosevelt comes back from Yalta, and Roosevelt's dying. And in fact, dies in April of 1945, and the UN conference is scheduled to open just a couple of weeks later. He's succeeded by Harry Truman, who, like Vandenberg, had been a senator, and they had been friends in the Senate. And that means a couple of things. First of all, Roosevelt had been his own State Department, so the State Department had very little stature going into the UN conference. And then Truman, of course, famously had lunch once with Roosevelt in the, 7 or 8 months between the election and Roosevelt's death, so was really clueless on what was happening in the world, had not met any of the foreign leaders, had not been briefed on all the momentous policies that were being contemplated. And so they go to San Francisco. So first of all, you've got Truman coming out of the Senate and Vandenberg just breathing this huge sigh of release, because now I've got somebody who, instead of viewing us as this rival nuisance, I've got a former colleague who wants to work with me, and you've got Truman who says, I need to work with him, and there's a mutual respect there that was invaluable for American diplomacy. And then Vandenberg gets to San Francisco, and you've got a weak Secretary of State. At this point, it's Edward Stettinius, and reporting to a president who is a decisive and well-meaning new executive, but a new executive and a neophyte in foreign policy. And so Vandenberg really emerges with advisors who include John Foster Dulles and Nelson Rockefeller as the leading American delegate to the UN conference, sitting across the room from Molotov and Gromyko in the penthouse at the Fairmont Hotel, figuring out what the United Nations is going to look like, sparring over the veto, sparring over language that might allow regional defense pacts like the Monroe Doctrine, but brings it back to the Senate with something he can sell.
So how is it politically possible? During part of this period, Vandenberg himself was thinking of running for president. The Republicans have a huge defeat in the election of '48, and the Democrats take the House and Senate, and yet Vandenberg still seems able to endorse the Truman Doctrine and provide support with the Democrats. How was that possible?
I think he had been taking responsibility for building many of the outlines of it. It's almost impossible to imagine today, but no sooner does Vandenberg and his counterpart, the Democrat with whom he alternated chairing the Foreign Relations Committee, Tom Connally of Texas, no sooner do they get back from the UN in the summer of '45 than Truman calls them up and says, hey, we're about to begin peace treaty negotiations with all the defeated allies, with Italy and Romania, and figuring out boundaries and reparations and things, and ultimately Germany, like that in Paris this fall. Will you go to Paris? And so Vandenberg and Connally go to Paris, and they're engaged again around a big round table negotiating post-war peace treaties. And then he's one of the delegates to the first United Nations General Assembly in London, where Eleanor Roosevelt as one of the other delegates, and Vandenberg and Eleanor had a very difficult relationship, both because Eleanor was always defending her husband when Vandenberg attacked him, and Vandenberg distrusted her socialistic tendencies. He always was a good Republican. He said you got to be social-minded but not socialist. And so, and in fact, one of her pet schemes was in combating poverty in Appalachia. She had talked about a planned community called Arthurdale, and one of its cottage industries was to make furniture. And so here you have the federal government going into the furniture business, and that was Vandenberg's hometown industry in Grand Rapids. So at so many levels, he and Eleanor didn't get along. And so, but they're on the ship together going over to London for the UN conference, and at the end of that, he says to a friend, I take back everything I've said about her, and it's been plenty. And she ends up trying to, begging him to stay on for the next UN General Assembly, and he said, I appreciate the work you're doing, but I got to get back to the Senate. So it was great to see these evolving relationships.
Simply spending a lot of face-to-face time together on a boat seems to have made a difference.
It did, and I should follow up. So he came back from there. Then he goes back to Paris again in the spring. In fact, he was for further post-war treaty talks. So he was engaged in diplomatic activity almost the entire year before he ran for re-election in 1946, just returning to Grand Rapids to vote, basically. And so that made him very invested in the foreign policy of the Truman administration, because he had been one of the creators of it in many ways.
Tell us about the end of his life and career. He was attentive to the constitutional prerogatives in declaring war during the Korean War. So how did he end his life and career?
But yeah, to your point, he always wrestled with that constitutional question of the Congress's right to declare war. But when war suddenly erupts or is breaking out in an isolated way, and Korea was a primary case, there was never a declaration of war. And yet he wished that Truman had been able to consult with Congress more, but he also recognized the limitations when something is urgent and has to be done, of opening it up to congressional debate before a democracy can act. And he always struggled with that. But to your point, in 1948, the Republicans lose what had been their 2-year majority in the Senate. So now Vandenberg's no longer chairing foreign relations. George Marshall, with whom he had worked very closely, leaves the State Department and is replaced by Dean Acheson, with whom Vandenberg had a little trickier relationship. And war breaks out in Korea, and a young Republican senator named Joseph McCarthy starts going on the attack and finding communists everywhere, particularly in the State Department. All these things begin to fray the bipartisan strength that had obtained when the Republicans were in majority in the Congress and the Democrat Truman was in the White House. That was that golden age. And so when the Democrats got a majority, they didn't need Vandenberg as much. And then Vandenberg is diagnosed with lung cancer early in 1949, and his voice becomes muted right at a time when some of the isolationists feel like they've been co-opted by the Democratic administration, and they need to carve out their own policy, and McCarthy is creating a climate when that's a more comfortable position for a lot of Republicans to be in also. And so that was how his life was coming to an end. He fought for the military appropriation for NATO. So we approved participation in NATO, but the European countries didn't have any money to rebuild their military. So he fought for that appropriation as long as he could, and he got it passed in August of 1949, and in September of 1949 had half of his left lung removed at University Hospital in Ann Arbor. And while he returned once briefly to the Senate to vote affirmatively on a civil rights bill, he was never again active in the Senate, and his voice became muted, even as other voices were creating discord.
So say more. I really want the audience to understand how the structural and institutional changes that have made someone like him impossible, was it his greatness and the fact that he was devoted to Hamilton and moderation, or was there something about the Congress and the institutions of his day that made him possible?
I think clearly both. I mean, the legislative branch, there was more deference to the legislative branch. And so major senators were, I mean, maybe it's too strong to say household words, but were prominent figures in a way that they are much less so today. We tend to hear today about the leader and then certain outspoken members, but they don't carry the gravitas that they did then. Part of that is, I think, the Senate has both ceded, or the Congress has ceded, and the executive has assumed much more power for making rules, executive orders when you can't get legislation through. All of that tends to undermine the significance of the legislative role, I believe. And then Vandenberg was willing to step out and say, if there is an executive we can work with, it's my job to work with him. And I don't know that that's the animating spirit of the minority, or of the legislative branch when the opposing power is in the executive branch today.
Let's think of other structural changes that have made that bipartisan spirit impossible. In describing why Congress has become more polarized and less deliberative, political scientists have pointed to partisan gerrymandering, which entrenches incumbents, low voter turnout, and the direct primary, which mean that you get challenged from the left or the right and the people in the middle are punished, as well as the decline of things like the filibuster, which used to make compromise necessary. Any other thoughts about other institutional differences?
I think that the power even of incumbency has changed, where today gerrymandering, of course, has helped make incumbency all the more difficult to challenge. But in Vandenberg's day, I think if you were a senator of a certain stature, there was a pride among your constituents. You didn't necessarily agree with this guy, but you saw he was helping change the world in a sense. And that gave you a sense of civic appreciation, maybe, that's harder to come by today when somebody doesn't pass their party's litmus test on particular issues.
That's fascinating what you just said. Even if they didn't agree with him, they had a sense of civic appreciation that he was a leader. And that's the Madisonian ideal. Remember during the Liberty Medal, that incredibly moving moment when Joe Biden gave the medal to McCain, John McCain was talking about the ideal of representation as being enlightened representatives who would put the public interest above faction or party. And I'm trying to understand why it was that was possible then, as recently as Vandenberg's time.
Well, did we take more seriously the notion of a republic with a little r? I mean, that these were Republicans in that sense of I'm sending someone to Washington, and who I send is really important, not just because I've got a preconceived sense of how they're going to vote, but of that person as my representative. It seems very vague, but that's what it feels like.
It's exactly right, and that's exactly what Madison and Hamilton say in the Federalist Papers is the ideal. They say we're not creating a direct democracy, we're creating a representative republic, and if we succumb to these populist forces, then everything will collapse.
Yeah, and Vandenberg was so scared of populism, and one of the great, there was a Look magazine story on him in 1946, I think, and quoted one of his Senate colleagues that said, Van says the same thing that most Americans say, he just says it a little bit earlier. And there's a hint of genius in that kind of leadership, because he was no visionary. He was more the legislative engineer than an architect, but he wasn't so far out in front that he had difficulty pulling opinion along with him, but he didn't just go along with what the opinion was. He was just enough ahead of the curve that he could speak what people were beginning to think they thought.
That's a great definition of leadership in a democratic
It's very
society.
practical.
It is very practical. Just a little bit ahead, nudges rather than
That's right.
leaves. In terms of his suspicion of populism, you quote Edward R. Murrow's eulogy to him. We are now divided bitterly, hysterically, Murrow says, of the fear fostered by McCarthy, and of Vandenberg. He says he would have been confident that at the end of the day, little men of loud voice and small faith will yield to the collective judgment of the American people.
Now, you're not supposed to think that applies to the present day,
No,
are we?
on a nonpartisan basis here in the National Constitution Center. But why did he have that faith?
Because I think he felt himself close enough to public opinion and thought of himself as a reasonable person, and that if other people, if Americans were thinking, they would arrive at the same place he did. And in fact, this place is not like, well, a generation from now they'll recognize what a genius I was. It's like they're almost with me, and so they're right behind me, and I think that's what that meant.
It's almost as if he had the space to change his mind. He could be reasonable and reflect on the fact and change his mind, confident that with a little bit of nudging, the American people would come along with him.
I think he did, and there may even have been a certain self-confidence there that said he was a big fan of Emerson, and Emerson has his wonderful essay on self-reliance where he talks about express what you feel today in strong words, and then speak what you think tomorrow in hard words, even if it contradicts everything you think today. In other words, I think we like to have our politicians be principled and consistent, and Vandenberg was anything but consistent, but neither is life. And so he was ready to say, circumstances have changed, I gotta change with them. And that seems so obvious and so much what we would like in a public figure, and yet it seems like a very elusive quality.
Yes, indeed, yes. And we're standing here, look, we're looking at Independence Hall over there, that place where all of that compromise happened and all of the deliberation happened. And you need to teach us, if you could change one thing in American politics today to make a Vandenberg possible, what would it be?
Well, I guess you would have a recognition at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue that you really only accomplish something of lasting value if you sit down together and hash it out. And so, I mean, this is a very nonpartisan observation, but you need to have people at either end willing to recognize that compromise isn't a bad word. In fact, it's an art form. And it is the art form that is behind the genius of America. And it's the art form that is absolutely required to get the big things done.
But is it just the people we had in the last administration, for example, a president and a chief justice of the Supreme Court who both talked about the need for bipartisan compromise and legitimacy, but they found in practice it was harder to achieve than they expected because the institutions had become so polarized. So I'm asking you a lot. I'm asking you to solve the problem of American democracy, but how?
I look to you for that.
No, absolutely. Well, we'll figure it out with the audience's help because there's some really good questions. But what institutional changes could make that possible again?
Certainly, if the what was the great statement in a democracy, the election should be certain, but the outcome uncertain. Where in a totalitarian regime, the election's uncertain, but the outcome is certain, or something like that. Well, we have too many elections where the outcome is certain, and certainly gerrymandering is a part of that.
Yeah.
So that people aren't motivated to deliver results in the same way because they don't really have to go home to their constituents and make an argument that, look what I've accomplished. They just have to avoid being pilloried for doing something that their base doesn't approve of. And so that certainly is a big piece of it. You have to have an executive willing to acknowledge the role that Congress plays in representing the American people. And so, while we can struggle with that today, I mean, throughout history, bipartisanship didn't flourish between the executive and the legislature in the New Deal. Roosevelt had a preponderant majority and was brilliant at so many things, and I don't say it as and nobody else perhaps could have played the brilliant role he did in leading us in World War II. And so but he disdained Congress, and as long as he had big majorities, he could push through pretty much any domestic measure he wanted in the first New Deal, and it turned out more difficult in the second New Deal. And of course, the courts played a big role in how some of that was viewed. But he was in such a position of legislative strength and executive strength that he didn't see a great need for bipartisan cooperation. So you have to have enough of a balance in the government that that both sides, both parties and both branches see the need to work together.
That's a crucial and important and constructive point, that if you're not guaranteed of re-election by playing to your base, but have to win over people of different perspectives, that creates an incentive to...
And that has generally been the case throughout our history, which is why it's functioned reasonably well.
Questions from the audience, and then we'll... I've got some more questions for you too. There's some great ones here. After Vandenberg, Republicans became more internationalist, Democrats became more isolationists. Now both parties appear to be more isolationist. Republicans, America's first. Democrats, no more free trade, anti-NAFTA, and anti-TPP. What happened?
Well, it's interesting. With the Democrats were traditionally the party of freer trade, because the Republicans, they could invoke Hamilton and say protective tariffs, which of course were useful in the initial in the early years of building an industrial economy in the United States, but much less attractive in a world order where the United States is the great economic engine and needs trading partners. But the Republicans had that lingering bias, and then the Democrats were the party of free trade because they didn't want to be, of course, a lot of people know early history a lot better than I do, but they were in many cases the agrarian party and the Southern party, and they wanted to be able to buy goods at competitive prices and not be dependent on paying the prices to support the buildup of New England manufacturers. So you had that historical context, which I think the Republicans changed as they became a party representing business interests, certainly, who saw more value in global trade and more open economic relations. The Democrats, let's see, so the Democrats became more isolationist. Was that in reaction to, did that agrarian model become a more populist model that made you more suspicious of international agreements that would seem to benefit business, but that didn't have any obvious benefit, and in fact in recent days could be seen as, by some lights, as more of a threat to what had been the economic order? And so I suppose that would account for some of that evolution.
That was extremely well analyzed. Did think tanks play a role in Vandenberg's career? Think tanks know more about reform, tax, health, immigration. Were there hearings in Vandenberg's experience?
That's a great question. Well, two things. Brookings Institution was the early think tank, and Brookings people helped supply. Well, so So everybody agrees after World War II, European economies are devastated. People are starving. Winter is harsh. Just there's chaos. What's going to happen? Communist parties are showing strength in France and Italy, and may thrive on benefit from that chaos. So the Western Europeans need economic help. The United States sees it's in our interest to help, and so State Department comes up with the Marshall Plan. Marshall gets together with Vandenberg and said, how are we going to put this thing through the Senate? And Vandenberg, being a good Republican, blanches at first, says, wait, this is way too expensive. But then he becomes convinced of the need, breaks it down, says, well, if we make the European request for aid a little bit smaller and we do it over these number of years and we don't commit future Congresses to it, I've got something I can sell. And Truman, of course, had the wisdom to call it the Marshall Plan instead of the Truman Plan, because Marshall was so revered and respected and viewed as a nonpartisan. Marshall said, well, it could have been called the Vandenberg Plan, because once it got to Congress, Van was just the whole show. But they put that through the Congress, and one of the things Vandenberg said to the State Department is, we've got to make sure that this doesn't bankrupt us, that we can afford, that our economy can handle the Marshall Plan without slipping back into recession, and that the kind of resources we allocate are the right resources. And it was Brookings people who helped it. So Vandenberg says to Truman, let's get a commission to investigate this. And actually Averell Harriman chaired it. And they drew on a lot of Brookings research. So that was the one think tank connection at the time. I don't know of any others coming up. But the question on hearings, again, we talk about sometimes the lack of hearings today. The Marshall Plan hearings, I think, probably are still the most exhaustive hearings that were ever held in the Senate or perhaps in Congress. And Vandenberg's strategy was, we're going to listen to everybody. Anybody who wants to express a viewpoint, we're going to listen to. Basically, we're going to wear down the opposition that way. And also, we're going to tweak the legislation. He was kind of famous for making adjustments in, the State Department would send him a proposal. In fact, Dean Acheson, in his book, President the Creation, which is a brilliant book and I think set the stage for a lot of the historiography of that era, is kind of condescending to Vandenberg, because he said, present it to Vandenberg and he's got to put his stamp on it. And Acheson saw that as a reflection of senatorial ego. And it was to some degree, but it was also because Vandenberg said, we got to tweak it this way and tweak it this way and tweak it this way. And that may not seem like a big deal to you guys in the State Department, but it's going to allow me to sell it in the Senate. And so, and by listening to every opinion, he could incorporate what he needed to do to make that happen. And so he was a great proponent of exhaustive hearings to give everybody a chance to air their views.
Here's a great question near to my heart, and it is, was Vandenberg a fan of Louis Brandeis? Was he a fan of Woodrow Wilson?
I haven't got a good answer on Louis Brandeis. There wasn't a lot of interaction there. Wilson was fascinating because as a young editor, even though it was a different party, he was caught up in, one of the challenges that people talk about with a democracy is, it used to be when you had kings in Europe and they went to war, there was no great ideology involved. They were battling over turf for all kinds of reasons. But in a democracy, when we go to war, we seem to feel the need to give it that moral layer that demonizes the enemy and makes us always the good guy. And so and Wilson, of course, was the first exemplar of that in really turning American intervention in World War I into a moral crusade to save the world, make the world safe for democracy. And as a young man, that sounded good to Vandenberg. And so he probably bought into that too zealously, which fueled the reaction of the disillusion afterward that he shared with a lot of people. So he became very suspicious of, or skeptical of, and critical of Wilson after initially admiring him. And in fact, when he talked about Wilson going to Versailles, he editorialized and said he needed to lead the American delegation because it was such a weak delegation, and that Wilson's views were chiefly distinguished by use of the first person singular pronoun.
Lots of great questions about Vandenberg's relationships, and here's another one. How did Vandenberg's shift to internationalism influence his relationship with Robert Taft, and what influence, if any, did he have on Eisenhower's foreign policy?
Vandenberg and Taft had a really interesting relationship. They were the two Republican giants in the Senate and basically deferred to one another, with Taft saying, Van's in the lead on foreign policy and Taft is in the lead on domestic policy. And so that deference generally held to get things done. It began to fray with some of Taft's reservations about the scope of the Marshall Plan and the degree of commitment to NATO. But they basically, that was kind of their division of labor. And it was interesting because, Taft later became minority leader, but neither one was the leader. They were calling the shots, and they had committee chairmanships, but that really counted for more than Senate leader. Really wasn't nearly as important a position as it is today.
Two more questions. Why would original NATO creation be powerless without the U.S.?
Because without the U.S., you had collapsed economies and devastated militaries, and so that NATO without the U.S. would have been France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and later Britain. And compared to the Red Army sitting in Poland and down to Yugoslavia, they were no match. If without the U.S., had Stalin been inclined, there really would have been nothing to stop him from moving west. Now, that would have been very costly for him, and he had a hard enough time containing the occupied territories he was always in. He was already in, but you wouldn't have had either the American nuclear deterrent, which had just come into existence then, nor the military strength, the conventional strength to really protect those countries should something happen.
Well, this last question is a perfect opportunity for some closing thoughts about the significance of Van, and it is, how and why did Vandenberg sink into obscurity, and why is it important for Americans to remember his example today?
He'd been a newspaper man. He wanted to write his memoir. He didn't live to do that. He died while he was still in office. So he didn't get to he didn't get to write his own record. And then he'd had two would-be biographers who both died before they could finish anything. And I was trying to beat that jinx. And but that in the short, that would be whoever gets to write the history, that's how we remember it. And so that didn't happen. And then even in his hometown, where he was a mentor to the young congressman who became President Ford, things that were going to be named for him got named for President Ford. And so there was, but overall, I think, I would say Dean Acheson's memoir is so brilliant, and it gave him a lesser role. And if you're not of presidential stature, and you don't have anybody writing your biography, it's pretty easy to slip into obscurity.
Well, then, just to restate the final bit, why is it important for Americans to remember him, and what do you hope that the audience will take from reading this inspiring biography?
I think we have to remember where we came from as a nation, and that was a conception of government where people of differing opinions found ways to work together. And he gives us some of the greatest examples of how to do that, of how to be a partisan. I mean, he was never not a Republican, and a reasonably conservative one at that, but who recognized that two things. One, that he firmly believed that we speak with one voice as a nation to be effective in the world. And that, and so the other countries need to know that they can trust what they negotiate with the United States. So his famous dictum that politics stop at the water's edge. And the other was that notion of bipartisanship, meaning I've got some great ideas and you got some ideas and they differ, but unless we can put them together, things don't get done. And that just, he's sort of the for all of his flaws and huge ego and various challenges, he's kind of an apostle of that notion of working together. And I cherish that.
Apostle is a great word. You were getting some appreciative yeses from the audience for inspiring us with an example of a politician, Arthur Vandenberg, who embodied the founder's ideal of American deliberative democracy and bipartisanship at its best. Please join me in thanking Hendrik Meijer.